Everybody, welcome to the session, Talented, Passionate, and Underrepresented, Investing in Latino Edupreneurs. We're really excited to have you here with us to join us for this very important conversation. My name is Frances Massano, and I'm a Senior Managing Partner at NewSchools Venture Fund, and we are very excited to know who else is in the room with us. So what you'll see is a poll is going to come on your screen in just a little bit, and we'd love for you to say, what is your organizational affiliation? So we have a sense of who's in the virtual room with us. If you also are interested, please chat in your name, your organization, and your location, just so we have a sense of who we're talking to. So as I mentioned, I work at NewSchools Venture Fund, and NewSchools Venture Fund is a nonprofit venture philanthropy that invests in teams of educators and education innovators with the skill to reimagine K-12 education. So what we do is we find, fund, and support early stage education entrepreneurs across 3 investment areas: innovative schools, ed tech, and diverse leadership. The reason why I'm really excited about this conversation today is because, one, we are in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month. And what better way to celebrate the leadership, the assets, the great stories of strength within the Latino community than to feature these 4 amazing education entrepreneurs, workforce entrepreneurs, telling their stories about what they're doing and why they're doing it every single day. Second, we're having this conversation in the midst of twin pandemics. And we have seen during these pandemics of both COVID as well as systemic racism that the Latino communities is disproportionately impacted. And this has been showing up in health, economic, and educational disparities. And so when we're in this moment right now, as we think about the future of learning, we really need to reflect on what are the needs of the Latino community, knowing that 1 in 4 school children today identify as Latino, and that's growing to 1 in 3 by 2026. So if we're committed to ensuring that we have an education system that works for all students, it is critical that we have Latino leadership at the forefront so that those leaders can bring the assets, the vision, the aspirations of the Latino community to the forefront when they're designing solutions. And so this is a commitment that we have at NewSchools Venture Fund. We have long had a portfolio focused specifically on diverse leadership. We have made diversity, equity, and inclusion a cross-cutting priority. 40% of our staff identify as people of color. 40% of our founders identify as Black or Latino. But what we found was that when we had open funding opportunities, it ranged from investment area to investment area, but 8 to 18% of our applicants identified as Latino. And as a Latina, that was a problem. I know that there is tremendous innovation, ideas, as I was saying, the assets that we need from the Latino community that needs to be brought to bear as we think about the solutions required to address the needs in education. And so we were like, what are we missing? What are we getting wrong? It's not that Latinos don't exist with these great ideas, it's that we're not finding them. So we launched a research study to understand what were the ways that we should think about adjusting our approaches, and what are the ways that funders and investors overall should think about making changes to their approaches as well. And so we learned a couple of things after doing a few focus groups, after doing some quantitative research as well, some surveys, and there are 5 things that emerged for us. So one is that Latino education entrepreneurs tend to be juggling multiple responsibilities, more responsibilities than other entrepreneurs. Oftentimes they're young, so 86% said they were younger than 44. Many of them said that they were holding down a full-time or part-time job while they were going on their entrepreneurial journey. Many said that they were breadwinners and responsible for their immediate family or for their extended family in financial ways. And so the ideas of how do you prioritize being an entrepreneur while having all these responsibilities certainly came up. Second, we learned that the folks who participated in our research talked about their desire to be an entrepreneur as part of a long history, a long family history of entrepreneurship. About 51% of respondents said that they first learned about entrepreneurship by watching others in their family launch small businesses, right? So entrepreneurship is in our DNA, but those experiences are not always valued because of the way they might show up or the way they might manifest themselves. It's not necessarily what you might see on an Ivy League resume. Third, there was this idea that Latino education entrepreneurs have a strong calling to improve their local communities. it's a vocation to do this work. The idea is that folks want to directly address the inequities that they might have personally experienced, and talked about having deep connections with their community as part of their superpower, as part of their value add as they're developing their organizations. 4, we found that many of the people we talked to had a low familiarity with philanthropy and with other investors. I was shocked that fewer than half of the people we talked to had any awareness about the top 10 major education funders. And we're talking about like the Gates Foundation or like the Walton Foundation, just no awareness. And only 31% reported receiving any philanthropic funding at all. And so what that says to us is there's a lack of understanding or awareness about where you go for capital, lack of understanding of like, how do you navigate the process, and feeling like in some ways processes were set up that didn't benefit them. They didn't know the language, they didn't know the next steps. And so that was an area where we're really excited to dive into. And then lastly, many of the entrepreneurs that we spoke to talked about how much they valued the support they got from professional and community-based organizations. And I was shocked to see that Hispanic Chambers of Commerce came up as one area where people could go to for greater levels of support. And also what was frequently referenced were accelerators and other leadership development programs as key places to find support and to find help. And so we really want you all to dive into the report and into the research to learn more about what came up. But really the purpose of this conversation is not for me to share more of those stats, but really to center on the stories of these 4 amazing Latino education entrepreneurs who we have here, who want to tell you more about their story and more about their experiences as they've gone on their entrepreneurial paths. So with that, I'm going to ask our amazing panel to introduce themselves and answer this first question. I thought we would jazz it up a little bit so it's not completely boring, but 1, what song best describes your experience as an entrepreneur? And as you're answering that question, tell us a little bit about why you decided to launch your organization in the first part. And I will start with Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with each and every one of you. You know, I would actually say it's 2 songs because I think my entrepreneurial journey was a progression. I think I started off with Hard Knock Life with Jay-Z, and I've slowly transitioned over the last 6 years to Mood Forever by Beyonce. But as Francis mentioned, I'm co-founder and CEO of America on Tech, proud Puerto Rican woman from Brooklyn, East New York, and proud product of New York City public schools from K through 12. Was the first person in my family to graduate from college, from grad school, and then obtain a job in technology, and where oftentimes I found myself being the only woman and the only person of color on my tech teams. And my first starting salary as I entered the workforce was more than 4 times my family's annual household income. And I knew that the reasons for the lack of diversity in the industry could be directly attributed to the ways in which socioeconomic status and race determines where you live, what kind of access you have, and the kind of education that you receive. And I wanted to ensure that students, no matter where they're from, could participate in innovation in a meaningful way and take advantage of the growing technology sector by creating pathways for them. So thank you, and I'm happy to be here today.
Great. Jaime Martinez.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Jaime Martinez, I'm the founder and CEO of Scola. And so the 2 songs I also chose are, one for my entrepreneurial journey is My Way by Frank Sinatra. And the other song that I chose for fundraising purposes was I Will Survive by Aretha Franklin. And so I've been in the education space for over 10 years now. Prior to education, I was in finance marketing, got into education through Teach for America, and since year 1, I started helping my students find and enroll in schools that were better fit for their needs and their family needs so they can continue to learn. And so that's what we do now at Scola. We're kind of like the Yelp or dating site for families to find the right school for their kids across the country. And we are the sales force for schools so they can streamline their recruitment and enrollment process.
Iskaida, would you like to go next?
Yes. So my song is Started from the Bottom, Now We're Here. It just gets me amped up, reminds me where I've come from, where I am, and where I want to continue going. So Iskaida, founder and CEO of LaborX, the LinkedIn for the linked out. And we connect folks who go through alternative education, so alternative to a 4-year degree, to good jobs. And my motivation for starting this work is looking around in my community. I had a very different experience growing up poor in the Bronx, going to public schools, then had a very different outcome because I got into an Ivy League school. When I look back in my own home, you know, earning more than my mother, my brother didn't finish high school and so couldn't get a good job. It's not enough for me to succeed. Like, what do I do to, you know, make sure my family, my community, and other people who are not in my community but are in similar spaces thrive the same way?
All right, Michael, will you round us out?
Thanks, Francis. And this is such an important session, so thanks for having all of us. So my song is Ain't Nobody Gonna Break My Stride by some guy named Matthew Wilder, who I don't know if that was a one-hit wonder, but I love that song. It talks about nobody's gonna slow me down. I gotta keep on moving. And I think that's any entrepreneur's journey. You're gonna have bumps in the road, but if you just keep at it, it'll, you know, eventually you can move the world to the vision you want it to be. I'm the CEO of Strive and You Strive. We run a virtual mentoring platform through which we connect students who, underserved students who are looking to apply to college, get financial aid, get scholarships, more recently get career advice. We connect them with mentors from all across the country who want to help them on that journey. We're really proud to say at this point, we've reached about 1.1 million students. And the reason I started this is I actually transferred from a private to a public high school when I was a junior in high school, first public school I ever went to. And we only had one counselor for every 1,000 students in my school. And growing up, my Mexican-American grandpa, I called him Papa, he always told me that not everybody had an equal opportunity in America. And I'd say, Papa, everybody has an equal opportunity. It's America. And he'd call me a menso, which in Spanish means moron. And it wasn't until I transferred to this public school that I saw firsthand that not everybody does have an equal opportunity. And my mom was the first in our family to go to college. And it changed our family's trajectory forever. So I'm, you know, really blessed to be working on this today as a legacy to my grandparents who worked 2 jobs each to send my mom to college as the first in our family to go. And he was right. I was a menso, but I'm trying to make up for it now. So.
Great. So I think it's important for us in this conversation to start with, why is Latino leadership important to begin with? And I think, you know, sometimes folks are like, we don't have to think about race, we don't have to think about identity or these other identity markers as we're thinking about investing or thinking about the importance of the work. So I just want to start off with, one, what is the business case for Latino leadership? And Jessica, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I think it's important to know for those folks who want us to get rid of our cultures as we enter into spaces, is to know that we don't have the privilege of doing that. So when I think about the business case for Latino leaders, the first thing that comes to mind for me is really upon respecting the Latino consumer. You know, while there is a moral case for investment, there's also a business case. And in my mind, you know, we need to understand the Latino buying power is 1.7 trillion in 2019, and it's only projected to grow to about 2.3 trillion in 2024. Also, 98% of Latinos own a smartphone and are 4% more likely than the general population to actually own one. And so this means that we're connected, this means that we are consumers, and it means that we are contributing meaningfully to our economies. Also, in a sector like education technology, with us being connected and owning devices, and 57% of us spending anywhere between 1 to 5 hours on a phone per day, there's a huge missed opportunity when entrepreneurs can't build solutions in the ed tech space. In New York City alone, Latino students make up 40% of the students in the 1.1 million students in the system, and they attend schools where 3 out of 4 children are actually experiencing poverty. So it's a huge missed opportunity to have Latino leaders to be able to participate in the development of products and services and not have funding actually be the things that stall them from actually scaling and growing their own businesses. And last but not least, I think it's important to point out that Latinos don't want you, and I'll actually speak for myself, I don't want investors investing in me because I am a Latina. I want investors looking at me as a viable entrepreneur because they believe in my representation and they believe that my assets as a Latina can actually contribute meaningfully to innovation.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in real quick here as well, Jessica. Like, I couldn't agree more. And you know what I would say is, yo hablo dos idiomas. I have twice the market share, right? So that's right off the bat compared to a monolingual entrepreneur. That's what we come with, right? And what we're talking about is if I can reach double the market size, that's just good business. And you know, with all the stats that Jessica was just talking about, it just makes sense.
Yeah, like if you look at it from an investor framework, right, you'd want to bet on the fastest growing segment in a market. And the fastest growing segment in this country are Latinos. So it just, you know, like Jessica and Jaime have said, you know, it makes total sense.
Sarah, what would you add to this conversation, then maybe thinking about the moral imperative of why Latino leadership is critical and why we should be focused on it?
Yeah, I think, you know, lucky for every investor on this call, there is a very strong business case for investing in entrepreneurs like us. But building on that, I think the moral case is, I want to use an analogy of what's happening in this country right now and zoom out and look at all the new language that we're learning. Well, not some of us, it's new for some people, but, you know, being not racist versus being anti-racist, leading with your values, I think in the end tells people who you value, what you believe, right? So if you just say, you know, I invest in, you know, based on merit, based on the idea, I'm not going to look at any of this stuff, that's a noun, right? That's like not being racist. I'm not a racist. That's a type of person that I am. Versus being an anti-racist, more of a verb. You know, what am I actually doing to actually build a portfolio that is projecting my vision of the world? And what am I telling you know, the entrepreneurs out there about what I think about their worth and their value? What if I go home, what do I tell, you know, if I have children, if I want to have children or grandchildren, about the world that I want to leave behind for them? Is it a world where I believe that your zip code doesn't define your abilities? And if that's the case, then you need to actively be going out there and building this pipeline. And what, you know, we're going to get into this a little later in the conversation, but what we hear as an excuse from a lot of investors is, oh, the pipeline's not there, or, you know, and there are all these artificial markers of, you know, what a good idea is. You know, do you have this runway? Do you have these many people? Do you have these many users? And then wondering why a lot of diverse entrepreneurs don't apply for funding or don't end up meeting their standard. And then I think about, you know, I'm in the space of recruiting, so, you know, thinking about as an entrepreneur, as a Latina, as a woman, as a Black woman, I want to go somewhere where someone sees, you know, to what Jessica said, someone sees my worth, knows that I can contribute, values that contribution. And so if you're not in this in the space already where you've built a diverse portfolio, then you're going to be turning off potentially other entrepreneurs who might need, you know, these artificial markers that you might set. And so you're going to be the one that's losing, both on a business basis, but also on a moral.
100%. And it's interesting because as you've been talking, you've been alluding to this concept of like your unique perspective as Latinos, right? And that unique perspective is something that should be invested in. It's something that is valuable. That's something that is needed, right? And so I'm curious, like, what do you think you bring as Latinos that enables you to kind of understand the market in a different way and then to come up with innovation? I mean, Jaime, you just talked about like, yo puedo hablar dos idiomas, right? Like I have access to 2 markets because I speak 2 different languages. So what else? Like, what is the unique perspective that you think investors would be supporting by supporting more leaders like you?
Yeah, so one thing, I think everyone mentioned it, right? We all have some sort of connection to what we're doing now and saw a business case for it, where we were able to create a company around it. And that myself, right, coming, being an immigrant, like first generation, going to bad schools, quote unquote bad schools, and experiencing, having that opportunity of going to a bad school, and then having the opportunity after my parents were able to gain some of their, so quick, more background. My parents are both dentists from Mexico, but when we came over, that means nothing, right? And so I saw them rise up, and in that time, we were able to rise up as well. And so having to see both sides of the education system and saying that they're, everything's equal is definitely not the case. And I saw that firsthand, not just as a student, but as a teacher. And so all the way through, and then, when as a teacher, starting to place students in schools that were better fits for them, and then getting in trouble for that because they're saying, hey, that student is a dollar amount to this school. It's just like mind blowing. And so all that to say, the mentality I think that we all have is, I couldn't say it better with Jessica, don't invest in us because we're Latinos. None of us have that victim mentality here. We're all doing it, and we've done it with and without you. And we're going to continue doing it, and you can see by the choice of songs, right? And so we all have this this connection to what we're doing, and we're knowledge. We are experts and domain experts in what we're doing. And so there's that whole moral dilemma, but at the end of the day, like, we're not here asking for a chance because of who we are. It's because of what we bring to the table and the experiences.
Others, do you have a thought here?
I have a thought here. So I think if we all acknowledge that there is all of the systemic isms in this country, a lot of Latinos, Latinas, Latinxers are either immigrants, first, second, maybe even fifth or sixth generation, right? And what the immigrant experience, depending on how close or far away from it you are, shows is that for most of us, right? Some of us maybe were high, like upper middle class or wealthy in our home country, but I don't think that's not most of our narratives. It means that you've had to do a lot more with a lot less. It means you show up, your parents, your grandparents, whoever, you've built your life with a lot less resources, than the non-Hispanic, non-Latinx, non-white person who grew up in this country, right? So you didn't come with a lot of resources. You've learned to do a lot more with a lot less. You're extremely resourceful. And so when you think about entrepreneurship, when you're starting something out, those are values that investors are oftentimes looking for. They don't want people burning through their money. They want people who are very judicious, who can work a lot with limited resources, prove things out. So I just want to add that too. I mean, so imagine if you do resource a Latinx entrepreneur really well, someone who's already used to being shortchanged by the system and has still figured out how to do well, how to survive. Imagine what they can do when they are very well resourced.
Yeah, and I want to just add a point there, because I think what Iscaida is saying is, I think it's incumbent on the entire sector to really focus on an entrepreneur's distance traveled, as opposed to the things that make them feel like safe investments, right? If I am a Latina and I grew up in the hood in East New York and in Brooklyn, went to public schools my entire life, got to college, worked in the private sector, started a company, have sustained that company for 5 years. At some point, I would like for you to just give me the benefit of the doubt that something miraculous there's something miraculous about me, that I'm even in this room with you at this time. And so I think that is really incumbent for people to focus on things that are not about pedigree, or not about whether or not, we fit a certain mold, but focus really on the distance travel to even have been able to get to know you and be in the same vicinity as you.
and strive to end that, right? So like we shouldn't have to walk 10 times the distance for you to even listen to us when you're listening to other people by virtue of who their parents are and they made a recommendation, or they're your buddy's friend, or you went to school with that buddy.
Yeah. And so what you're all talking about is this is not about a lack of talent in the Latino community. This is not about a lack of vision or a lack of drive, but it's about the issue of a lack of access and opportunity. And so what we need to think about is how do we bridge that access and opportunity divide? And so oftentimes when we have these conversations, and we have this conversation all the time in education, where, you know, in K-16, it's like, well, do you put all your efforts in supporting the students? In this case, we put all our efforts in supporting the entrepreneurs to better navigate. Or should we be focusing more on how investors and funders and other actors in the space need to change their practices and approaches to then better engage and better meet the needs of Latino entrepreneurs? So I'm just curious to hear, like, where do you all fall on this side of the debate? And maybe Michael, do you want to start us off here?
Sure. So I think capital has a lot of dominant effects, right? Like where capital is funneled or not funneled determines a lot of who gets even access to grow a business, right? And to scale something. And so from my perspective, investors need to take a hard look, especially in the education space, and specifically, at least on our nonprofit side. You know, when you go for a nonprofit grant, they make you fill out like a 12-page, you know, report of everything you're gonna do. And, you know, in any startup, like most of that is nonsense, okay? Once you get going, like you have a lot of pivots and turns, and it doesn't matter if, you know, you went to Andover and Yale, or you helped run your family's, you know, small store in the Bronx after high school, right? Like no matter who you are, where you're from, on the entrepreneurial journey, you're gonna pivot, you're gonna have bumps. And I totally agree with what everybody said, that really when you're backing someone as an entrepreneur, you're backing their relentlessness, their perseverance. You're not backing, like, who cares, you know, if they got a degree from wherever. In fact, I have friends who would say, oh, if this doesn't work out, I can always go work at McKinsey. Well, that's not someone you want to back. If they're like, if I misuse your money, whatever, I can go make a lot of money somewhere else. Like that's a mentality that when you look at folks who have less, it's really true that they are more likely to roll up their sleeves and know how to do a lot with a little. And so from my perspective, I think investors need to do two big things. One, bet on the person and measure that person by their relentlessness and perseverance. And two, not just give to folks you're comfortable giving to because they're the friend or they're the kid of your friend.
Jessica, I think you might have a different perspective on this one. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's so interesting because a lot of times I think people in this sector, they tend to say, well, no, it's the entrepreneur, and then the others are like, no, it's an investor. And I actually think it's not either or. I think it's and, right? Because in order for the ecosystem to actually work, both parties have to be fully prepared to engage with one another. You know, as an entrepreneur in 2014, when I was starting my organization, there were a lot of things that I would have to say were learning gaps. And on this call, I actually really want to make sure that I shout out Camelback Ventures because they were my first really big investors. And for those of you who don't know, they are an education entrepreneurship accelerator for entrepreneurs who are underrepresented and underestimated in the industry. And they gave us our first $50,000. And it was through my involvement in that program that I learned the language, that I learned the ecosystem, that I understood who the funders were, that I understood what a program-related investment was, what equity was, and all these things that were very far from me. Because while entrepreneurship was not a foreign concept, right? Like I grew up in Brooklyn, bodega entrepreneurs, you have hot dog cart entrepreneurs, you have rainbow shops, right? Like these are really big, enterprises in my mind in the communities that I'm from. So entrepreneurship wasn't far from me. What was different was understanding the ecosystem by which corporate entrepreneurship and nonprofit entrepreneurship look like. And so what I really needed was for someone to really demystify. And so I think that it is incumbent on the investor to do the work to make sure that they are unbiasing their processes as much as possible. But I also think there is some culpability on the entrepreneur to be so fully self-aware about what their gaps are. And in the moments where, they have identified their gaps, to try and fill those gaps. And in the moments where investors are running into entrepreneurs that might not have the language to speak to them effectively, I think it's up to the investor to see this as an opportunity to cultivate someone as opposed to just taking them out of the race.
Yeah, I want to push a little bit on what you're saying, Jessica. I do agree with you that it's a yes and I do believe that there's a bigger onus on the investor here. So back to, what my peer here was saying, what Michael was saying, there is a power dynamic at play. The people who have the money have the power. And that's not to say we are powerless. We have our own power. We can choose who to engage and who not to engage, but we're often put in a position where we have to accept money from people we don't always want to accept money from, because they question us differently than they would question their other investments. They don't have the same patience with us that they would have with other investments. And so as I think about, where the greater responsibility to adapt to the entrepreneur is, I think it's on the investor. Granted, there's a mode of thinking, well, it's my money. I can do whatever I want with it. I can invest, wherever I want, or if this is my philanthropic funding, I made it. And so I think, folks need to take a bite of humble pie and think about how do they create proximity to, they might not have the proximity to the problem, they may not have the proximity to the entrepreneur, but instead of putting the onus on the entrepreneur to learn their ways or learn how to speak the lingo or, how to do this and how to do that, maybe think about investing in either learning the entrepreneur's way or better yet, elevating people like Francis, who's already been elevated, but continue to elevate people like Francis who know the vernacular of the Latinx entrepreneur who grew up in Brooklyn or in the Bronx or in East LA or, all of the other communities that teach us how to survive and how to be resilient and how to thrive in spite of everything, right? So I think, particularly, and another thing I want to add on this is particularly with income inequality and the rise of income inequality and COVID, you can, if you look at the top 10 companies leading the stock market, and you don't look at anything else, you would not know that there is a double pandemic going on around COVID and around racism in this country and in the world, because they are thriving and they are the ones that are basically choosing and minting the next set of millionaires and billionaires. So I do think back to the moral imperative, I think, because of the power dynamic, the investors do have an outsized responsibility to do this well and to do this right.
And I think that investors have an opportunity to actually try to democratize social capital, right? Which if you're in, if you're investing in the education space, for profit or nonprofit, you probably want positive change in the education space. And to me, the most positive change you could do is start to democratize social capital by investing in underserved, diverse entrepreneurs who, if folks don't know a certain lingo or don't know how to close a big customer, help them. Beyond the money, a lot of things an investor can do is help the entrepreneur build the business, a good investor at least. And I think, that's one of the most philanthropic things anyone can do is help someone who doesn't know the ropes and show them the ropes. We see that every day on our platform. We're connecting kids to mentors who are professionals, and they're sharing their networks, their social capital to help kids get internships, jobs. So it's all about connectivity. To me, it's capital and connectivity, and there's a huge opportunity here.
So this is where it's a really tough one for me, right? I agree with that. It's a both type of solution, but I actually think it's more on the entrepreneur side of things, right? And one thing that I'll speak to for what you just said, Michael, if I'm an ethnic, if I'm an investor, investing in a for-profit company, I'm not necessarily investing to make a difference in the education space, right? To be completely honest, as an investor moving forward, it's the second largest industry in the U.S. Sometimes the first. It goes hand in hand with healthcare. There's a ton of money to be made in education, first off, right? As an investor, I want to make money. That's it, right? I think there's a potential side if I want to make an impact to fund nonprofit companies, but I'm speaking as a for-profit investor and a for-profit entrepreneur. I think, it's on us to understand the game. Similar to like Jessica said, right? You had the opportunity to go through Camelback Ventures. I had the opportunity to go through an incubator and accelerator, which was like entrepreneurship 101 and then 400 level classes of entrepreneurship. It wasn't until I understood the game that I got the investment and got to where we are. Unlike the small business, unlike that hot dog stand or anything, we're building a massive company. That's what we're going after, right? And I want investors that are going to be with me who have that expertise of how to build massive companies, not because of who I am, but because of what I'm building and because of our metrics. When I talk to people nowadays, we had an opportunity that like completely switched everything for me. We had an acquisition come to us, and we were going through that process, which just validated everything that we were going through and just made me understand that there is this power dynamic. But now, once you understand the game, you can leverage all that power against the other side as well, and not just against it, but with it. And so there's two sides of the thing. I think it's less likely that investors are going to change their focus on getting capital out. At the end of the day, they're trying to make money. And it's on us to learn the game and to change the game. As a future investor, I'm going to be looking for companies. And if they're ran by Latinos, even better. I know exactly how to serve them.
I mean, this is a tension. It's interesting to me, even as I support Latino leaders across our strategy, what comes up oftentimes is like, teach me how to play the game. Thank you. And also like, the game needs to be different. And so I think what we're saying, and it's been coming up, is like, we need to be working on both fronts, right? We need more accelerators and more leadership development programs like Camelback. They're one of our grantees. So we love them. We celebrate them. To equip folks with the rules of the road. But we know if the game keeps on being played in the same exact way, and I hear you, right? Folks are looking for the business case, but it's like, how do we get to an expanded business case at this point in time so that more money can flow, more opportunity can exist? At least that's the point of view that we're putting forward at NewSchools. But it's interesting, Jaime, because as you were just making your case for the change needs to start with entrepreneurs, you started to allude to an experience you had when you didn't feel well supported by an investor or by a funder. So you don't know how to play the game, but you didn't start off that way. So help us understand what that was. What was your experience and what lessons came from that?
Yeah, I'm going to be just frank here, right? So while going through the seed process, and raising seed round, there's this narrative that's fed through shows like Silicon Valley, like all the books that are out there, that you have to be this type of entrepreneur saying these type of things in order to get to they make the game seem a lot more straightforward than what it is. But in that process, I lost myself in my identity as to who Jaime Martinez is, what I bring to the table, and what a great business I built, by the way, and being able to tie all that into one thing. after going through being approached for acquisition, that just like rebalanced everything for me. It was a really interesting time. And so it validated all those negative things that were being said to me at the board level of just like, hey, you're sucking, you're sucking, you're sucking. And like that extra magnifying glass that we had on this because of who I am and what I brought to the table, right? And so after that, I realized, okay, like we have so much to offer. And now I know the game, but now I know myself and my part in that game. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting transition for me personally as an entrepreneur. I got to understand the game, and so now it's been a lot easier. So just to give you some context, it took 4 weeks to put together the Seed Plus round that we're doing, versus like a year to put together our seed round. Sure, it's due to business metrics, but it's also because we understand who and how we should be speaking with.
Okay. Thank you for sharing your story. So there's a lot of like lessons in there and also like advice. And so I'm wondering, with the 3 minutes we have remaining, maybe I'll start with you, Iskaida. What is one piece of advice that you have for investors? What could they be doing better to support Latino entrepreneurs? And then we'll kind of go across the panel as we wrap.
Yeah, I think if they start from the place that there is a gap in investing in Latinos, then I think there should be a commitment in accelerating investment in Latinos, right? And investments doesn't necessarily just mean writing the $50,000, $100,000 grant. Like, there are many ways to invest in entrepreneurs like us. So I think of the first person that actually invested in me. Her fund didn't write me a check, but she managed to figure out how to pay for me to go to a conference with a bunch of other funders. And she's like, here's who, and gave me all like the skinny on like, this person wants to invest in this person wants to invest in that. So she put me in a place of power and influence. I walked out with my lead investor for my pre-seed round, and that woman just picked up the phone and called 3 other women she knew who ended up writing checks for me, women that had never met me, right? So like put her own name and her like capital on the line for me. So these are 2 women that I think about. I'm like, you need more of that, right? So this first woman, she didn't write me the check, but she was able to get me in a room with people who were writing checks. And this other woman who wrote me a check then got other people, like without 10,000 hoops, to write me that check.
Michael, what would you say?
So I love that story, by the way. I was going to say along the same lines, even if you don't put the first money in, your network is everything. We just closed a big customer from someone who's never put any money in. He just introduced me to his college best friend who runs a big company, and they ended up being a customer. But for me, I think it's all about investing in the person versus the resume. Believe in that person's relentless drive. Look at their track record of making things happen. The truth is, in the startup world, nothing ever ends up being what's